Welcome back, survivor. If you can hear this, it means you're still alive. This is Jack's Nightmares, and this is your next story. The desert doesn't cool off at night the way people expect. It just changes. The heat slips into the ground, and the wind starts carrying a silence so complete it feels like it's pressing in on your ears. No honking cars, no school buses, no vendors shouting over each other. Just stone and sky and the pyramids, still and enormous, like they're waiting for something. That night, I was leading a private tour inside the Great Pyramid. I'd done it so many times I could have walked the Grand Gallery blindfolded. The group was typical for these after-hours slots. A wealthy British man named Stephen, his teenage sons, Mark and Daniel, and their interpreter, Lucille. Tagging along at the back was Remy, an archaeology student from Cairo University who'd begged his way onto the tour for research credit. They were moving slow, listening, half bored, half impressed. I'd just finished explaining the angled ceiling blocks when Mark looked down at his phone and frowned. "Why is it stuck on this red screen?" he asked. I assumed it was a prank, some YouTube video or an app glitch, but then Lucille checked hers, and her expression shifted fast. Same alert, different language, Arabic, then French, then English. The message kept looping. Emergency broadcast. Biological threat detected. Seek shelter immediately. That was the moment the night stopped being normal. Now that's not something you just brush off. Cairo doesn't issue alerts unless it's serious, and even then, they usually bury it in a press release 3 days late. This was different. I tried to radio the plateau checkpoint. Nothing. Static. Switched channels. More static. My stomach went tight, but I kept my voice steady and told them we'd head back toward the entrance to check with the guards. We moved quick, not running, but not exactly strolling either. The air inside the pyramid was hotter than I remembered, like the heat had thickened and settled in the stone. By the time we reached the passageway that led to the outer entrance, I knew something was wrong. The guard station was empty. Not just no guards. Nothing. No gear, no cups, no jacket, no food, like they always leave behind. It was like someone cleaned the whole thing out in 30 seconds. That's when we heard the dragging sound. It was faint but clear. Something moving over stone, slow and uneven. Not footsteps. More like wet cloth being hauled across rough tile. Everyone froze. I turned my flashlight toward the entrance tunnel. Nothing. But then I heard it again, closer this time. Mark, the teenager, thought it was smart to stick his phone through the archway and record. What showed up on his screen made me step in front of him and shove him backward. Something was crawling up the tunnel. Its shape wrong, like the joints didn't know which way to bend. Pale arms smeared in dust, a head twitching side to side like it couldn't figure out where it was. It was a man. At least, it used to be. But his jaw was slack, mouth too wide. His skin was stretched and dry, blotched like he'd been half-cooked under the sun. Eyes cloudy but locked onto the movement. When his hand hit the floor, it left behind something that looked more like a smear than a print. I slammed the old security grate shut and locked it with the bolt. Not designed to hold out much, but better than nothing. The man, thing, slammed into the gate hard enough that it rang. Once, then again. He wasn't alone. 2 more shadows appeared behind him, moving with the same broken, jerking crawl. Rami grabbed one of the flashlights and said nothing, but I could see it in his face. He recognized what we were looking at. Everyone did. There wasn't a single voice from them, no shouting, no growls, just skin-scraping stone and bones hitting metal. That silence was worse than any sound. I shouted for everyone to move, fast, back up toward the king's chamber. I knew there was a side corridor past the main shaft, one that led toward the older, deeper chambers most people never see. We took that turn hard. Stephen stumbled, but Lucille grabbed him and pulled him along. We didn't stop to argue, not with that pounding echoing behind us. There was a point, about 60 steps up the gallery, where I hit an old wooden partition and pulled it shut behind us. I dropped the latch into place. It was just meant to keep visitors out during maintenance, but it'd buy us a few seconds if those things started climbing. Once we got a moment to breathe, if you could call it that, I did a quick check. Everyone was still with me. Daniel, the younger son, was crying, but quiet. Stephen looked like he wanted to throw up. Rami was already checking his bag, making sure his multi-tool and notebook were still inside. Lucille kept watching the corridor we'd come from, holding her phone like it might save her. No signal, not even a flicker. She tried the emergency frequencies, but the display kept resetting. Same red alert banner. Over and over. I looked at my own phone. Same thing. Only, I had one old trick left. An offline map with interior layouts. I told them we had two options. We could go back toward the Queen's chamber and try another exit. Unlikely now. Or we go deeper. Toward the unfinished chamber at the base of the pyramid. Rami backed me up. Said he remembered from his coursework that there were side access shafts used during early excavations. Some were sealed. Others, not so much. Lucille didn't like it. Claimed we'd get lost. Die of dehydration. I told her we'd die faster waiting in a corridor if those things broke through the grate. I didn't waste more breath on it. We moved. Anyone who wanted to stay behind was free to do it alone. The tunnel down was steep, narrower than anything we'd been through so far. I had to duck in places. Stone dust caked the walls and clung to our skin. No lights down there. No air movement. Felt like walking into the stomach of the earth. When we finally reached the bottom, the chamber was worse than I remembered. Just a raw pit, unfinished, like someone gave up halfway through carving. There was scaffolding left from the 90s restoration teams, rusted and loose. Floor was cracked limestone, old beams stacked in a corner like forgotten bones. I turned off my flashlight for a moment. It was total blackness, a kind of dark that chews at your sense of direction. No breeze, no hum, just your own breath and everyone else's fear crowding into your ears. We did an inventory. 4 bottles of water, 2 packs of energy bars, 3 flashlights with dying batteries, a broken camera, a Swiss Army knife, and Rami's notebook. That was it. Nothing useful for defense. No way to call for help. We sat down, not because it was safe, just because there was nowhere else to go. Lucille cried quietly into her sleeve. Stephen tried to make a joke about this being a story for the grandkids. Mark didn't laugh. Daniel wouldn't speak at all. Time moved differently down there. My watch still ticked, but each minute felt like 5. I kept hearing faint knocks through the stone. Maybe it was the pyramid settling. Maybe not. Rami started sketching the chamber in his notebook, hands steady, almost calm. I asked him why. He said, in case no one ever comes. Someone should know what happened here. That stuck with me. So I pulled out my phone, switched to the recorder, and started talking. If this thing has any power left, maybe it'll outlast me. My name is Layla Mansour. I'm 29 years old. I've worked this site for almost a decade. Tonight I led 5 people into the Great Pyramid. Now we're trapped. Something's loose out there in Cairo. Maybe everywhere. The low, constant buzzing in my ears, like a bad frequency stuck in the back of my skull, wasn't from the phone. The screen had gone completely dead now. Battery was still at 42%, but no display, no options, no signal. Just a flicker, like the entire network had been erased. We stayed quiet for a while in the unfinished chamber. You could hear the faint breathing of each person, though no one said a word. Rami sat cross-legged, sketching what little he could in the dim light. Stephen leaned back against the wall with his jacket balled under his head, staring upward into the black. The boys were curled up together now, Daniel finally asleep, Mark wide-eyed, and still gripping the flashlight like it was a weapon. Lucille hadn't moved in 10 minutes. She just kept looking at the tunnel behind us. It didn't feel like we were inside a pyramid anymore. It felt like a bunker with crumbling walls. And those sounds from above, distant at first, but slowly growing sharper, didn't belong to any natural night out here. Gunfire echoed in the stone, muffled, but unmistakable. Bursts in clusters, then yelling. Male voices, then more gunfire. I stood up and crossed back into the lower tunnel, keeping my flashlight off and ears wide open. The sounds weren't inside yet, but they were moving, maybe along the northern ridge of the plateau. Couldn't be more than a few hundred meters from the entrance. Lucille joined me after a moment, whispering something under her breath in French. I didn't ask what it meant. Her eyes already told me. Then we heard it. A scream, short and fast, cut off halfway through. Not a gunshot. Something faster. A ripping sound, like clothing torn too quickly. Then boots. Real heavy boots, running toward the pyramid entrance. 2 sets. Then one. Mark stood behind us, gripping the side of the wall. "That was right outside," he said, voice low and flat. I nodded. We didn't have any way to help whoever was out there. And even if we did, those screams, that tearing sound, whatever had done it wasn't going to stop for first aid. Another echo reached us. Not voices this time, not human ones at least. Just a mix of groaning and fast, shuffling footfalls. Dozens of them overlapping, like a pack of animals swarming over stone. I didn't need to look to know that the main entrance to the pyramid was no longer an option. I made the call to move back up the access corridor. Rami helped with the boys. Lucille stayed close to Stephen, who was still favoring his leg after the sprint earlier. The dust in the shaft choked the air, and the higher we climbed, the hotter it got. At some point, the sandstone felt warm under my palms, not from the sun above, but from the press of bodies moving through these tunnels. We weren't the only ones using them tonight. We made it back into the grand gallery. The chamber looked different now. Same structure, same walls, but the air had shifted. There was pressure behind it, like the weight of the whole desert had sunk in on us. The wooden partition was still intact, but the sounds behind it were getting louder. Not banging, not yet, but rustling, sniffing, something pacing outside it. Stephen wanted to try reaching the surface again. He said if there were soldiers nearby, maybe someone had cleared a path. Lucille backed him. Mark too. They argued fast, not yelling, just desperation leaking through in volume. I held up a hand, told them we'd check the view from the upper vent slit, the narrow shaft that faces out from near the king's chamber wall. Just enough space to see part of the plateau. I crawled through first, with Mark behind me, careful to keep our lights off. The slit wasn't much wider than my shoulders. Dust burned in my nose, and the stone scraped at my arms. I reached the opening and pressed my face near the edge. The night was black, but not calm. I could make out fires flickering across the plateau, maybe tents or trucks burning. A small flare had gone off somewhere further north, lighting up the entrance to the site office for a second. That's when I saw them. Dozens of figures, walking without direction, some hunched, others limping, all of them moving in that same slow, dragging rhythm. At first, I thought it was just a crowd, until one of them lunged at something on the ground. I heard a scream, distant and short, and watched as 5 more dropped down around it. The figures didn't rise again, neither did the screaming. I backed away from the slit slowly. Mark didn't ask questions. His face was white, mouth slightly open, like the words had gotten stuck in the back of his throat. I helped pull him back, and we crawled out together. "I saw people," he finally said, voice cracking, "all over the plaza. They're just walking." I didn't correct him. He knew exactly what he saw. We both did. Back in the chamber, I told the group the truth. The exit was overrun. Whatever was happening in the city had spread. Lucille asked if it was a riot, maybe some kind of outbreak. I told her it didn't matter anymore. The pyramid wasn't a monument tonight. It was a trap. The only question now was whether we made it a tomb, or something we could survive in. Stephen stood, looked like he was going to argue again, but then we all heard it, a new sound, heavier than the ones before. Wood cracking, slow, deliberate pressure on the partition gate. Not frantic, not fast, just steady, like something pressing its whole body into the frame. Everyone froze. Even Daniel, who had been half asleep, sat upright. No one said a word. The wood gave again, creaked, under a new shove. I pointed toward the Queen's chamber tunnel and moved fast. We had to fall back. If that partition went, we'd be cornered here. At least the Queen's chamber had only one crawl tunnel in. A bottleneck. Better odds. The kids moved quickly now. Rami helped Daniel through the first shaft. Lucille and Stephen followed. I stayed behind, flashlight ready, aimed toward the dark. I watched the top corner of the partition slowly bend inward. Dust fell from the ceiling with each press. I held my breath, counted to 3, then turned and crawled fast through the tunnel after them. Behind me, wood split. Not fully, not yet, but it was coming. The Queen's chamber was cooler, damper. The walls here were unfinished, less polished, more fractured. The tourists huddled near the far wall, while Rami checked the corner shaft we might use to escape lower if needed. I sat just inside the entrance with the flashlight off, ears tuned to the tunnel behind me. Minutes passed, then more. No banging, no screeches. Just the distant echo of something moving slowly in the dark. Mark asked what the infected were. What kind of sickness did that? Rami said nothing. I finally told him I didn't know. But it wasn't normal. I'd seen heat stroke. I'd seen madness. This wasn't either. These things didn't scream when they were hit. They didn't back down. They didn't act like people anymore. We stayed like that for another hour, maybe more. My flashlight was at 30%. The others didn't check theirs. No one wanted to know how little time we had left. Then, quietly, Lucille whispered that she could smell something. At first I thought it was just the pyramid, the must, the dust, the old sweat in our clothes. But she was right. There was something else. Something sour. A smell like wet rot. Meat left in the sun. It was coming from the tunnel. The air had changed. I stood and motioned for everyone to get up. Quietly. No questions. Just move. We didn't have time to argue anymore. If we were going to survive the night, we'd have to go deeper. Into areas even I wasn't trained to navigate. The early excavators had dug blind. Some shafts collapsed years ago. Others might still lead somewhere. Maybe even outside. But we wouldn't know unless we took the risk. The smell crept in first. Heavy, organic, and wrong. It clung to the stone, stale and hot, like the air had passed through something rotting before it reached us. I couldn't tell how close the infected were, only that they were moving, slowly. No urgency in their steps, just persistence. Rami was already unzipping his satchel, pulling out a half-crumpled floor sketch he'd copied during his training at the university. It was a map of the lower tunnels, one of the early British drafts, back when they thought every shadow inside this place hid a secret passage or lost tomb. Most of the paths had been sealed after the 1920s, unstable, flooded, or never fully mapped. We weren't supposed to be down there, but we had no other option. Stephen tried to stand and nearly fell again. His breathing was shallow, and I noticed the hand pressed to his chest. I stepped closer and asked quietly how long he'd been feeling it. He said it started earlier that evening, claimed it was just the stairs, but I knew that tight grimace wasn't from a pulled muscle. I gave Lucille the last half bottle of water and told her to split it between him and the boys. Daniel was still barely responding, his mouth dry and eyes locked on the shadows. Mark had taken on the role of watching over him, trying to distract him with anything. A phone app, old jokes, a story about their dog back home. None of it worked, but he kept trying. I took the lead again, flashlight tilted low, and guided us toward the narrow shaft that dropped past the Queen's chamber into the lower foundation. There's a spot halfway down, flat enough to pause and gather bearings. But I didn't want to stop. The farther we got from the gallery, the more stone stood between us and the infected. As we descended, the air grew cooler, but heavier. It felt still, like the lower levels hadn't been disturbed in years. Cobwebs brushed my neck. The walls narrowed so tightly in places that I had to turn sideways and angle my shoulders just to squeeze through. Dust filled every breath, and with no airflow, it stayed suspended, gritty and dry on the tongue. The ground opened into the subterranean chamber, carved roughly from the bedrock. Unlike the polished halls above, this space was raw and jagged. Some believed it was never meant to be part of the original plan, just a failed experiment by the ancient builders. I never liked being here. Something about it always felt unfinished, like the pyramid itself had turned its back on this level and tried to forget it existed. We stepped into the chamber cautiously. Rami passed the beam of his flashlight across the room, revealing rusted scaffolding and an old digging platform left by one of the French teams decades ago. It had partially collapsed, with splintered planks scattered like matchsticks. To the right, a small tunnel sloped downward, only half visible through the dust cloud kicked up by our steps. I told them to sit and conserve energy. We didn't know how long we'd be down here. No food beyond 2 packs of cheap tourist crackers and a melted granola bar from Lucille's purse. 3 flashlights, only one with strong batteries. 2 smartphones still working, but with no signal and no usable apps. Rami had his multi-tool and a thin coil of nylon cord. I had a pen and a tour headset I hadn't used since this started. Stephen's breathing had turned into short, shallow puffs. Lucille crouched next to him, holding his hand like pressure alone could fix a failing heart. I watched his lips, dry and pale, and kept my distance. There wasn't anything I could say that would help him now. We gave him the remaining water. Mark kept glancing my way, like he expected me to offer some plan that didn't involve sitting in the dark and waiting for things above us to break through the stone. But there was no magic route. If we wanted to live, we'd have to risk going through the uncharted tunnels. Rami approached with the map again. "If these are correct," he said, "there's a collapsed section here, but a side path might still be accessible. It was closed in the 1880s after one of the diggers fell. They marked it as unusable, not sealed." I remembered that note. We used to make jokes about the ghost shaft in training. No one really believed it existed, just a mark on a crumbling sketch. But right now, a ghost shaft sounded better than no shaft at all. I nodded and signaled for everyone to gather their things. We left one of the flashlights behind, cracked and useless. The batteries were still good though, so Rami popped them out and pocketed them. I gave the boys a roll of gauze from the emergency kit in my bag, told them to hold on to it no matter what. Lucille wrapped her scarf around Stephen's shoulders and helped him stand. The tunnel we followed next was barely a tunnel at all. It started as a horizontal fracture in the bedrock, just tall enough to crawl into. The early teams had widened it slightly, but never fully reinforced it. Ceiling hung low, barely a meter in some places. Stone dust mixed with old wood chips from the broken platform. I led with the flashlight, careful not to kick up more than we could handle. Halfway in, we passed an old brass lantern still mounted in the wall. No fuel left, just rust, but the metal was warped outward, as if heat or pressure had bent it from the inside. I didn't mention it to the others. No point adding fuel to the kind of fear we were already dealing with. The shaft bent left and dipped down. We crawled for another 20 minutes before reaching a cavity that opened just enough to stand. Everyone collapsed into it without hesitation, backs against the cool stone. It wasn't much of a break, but it gave us a chance to breathe. Stephen was worse now. His skin had gone waxy. I asked Lucille if he had medication on him. She said no. He'd stopped carrying nitro tablets years ago. Thought he didn't need them anymore. I didn't have the heart to say what we were all thinking. If he went into cardiac arrest down here, none of us could help him. Then came the thud, faint at first, dull, distant, but not natural, not shifting stone or sand, something falling, then another. Lucille snapped her head toward the tunnel. "They're in the pyramid," she said, almost in a whisper, "not just above us anymore, inside, looking." I ordered everyone to kill their lights. Total darkness. We pressed into the chamber's edge, where the wall curved inward. Mark and Daniel crouched near the far end, their breathing sharp but controlled. Rami handed me a piece of cloth to wrap around the flashlight, creating a thin red glow, just enough to see outlines if needed. We waited. A long time. The tunnel behind us stayed silent. But the air, it had changed again. No longer stale. It moved now. Just a whisper of motion, and with it, the scent returned. Not strong, but enough to know we weren't alone anymore. I whispered to Rami that we'd move in 5 minutes. No sounds, no talking. Just follow the wall. We'd keep left, explore deeper into the fault line tunnel, and hope it didn't dead end. He agreed, quietly started prepping the gear again. Lucille leaned over Stephen, brushing his forehead with the scarf. He opened his eyes briefly and muttered something I didn't catch. But Lucille smiled at him anyway and said it was okay, that we were safe now. We weren't, but it wasn't a lie either. It was just what he needed to hear. I stood up slowly and ran my hand along the stone, feeling for cracks or wind, anything that could point toward an exit. My fingers brushed over an old chisel mark, deeper than the others. A symbol, maybe, not hieroglyphic, more like a surveyor's stamp, a marker, a direction. It was old, buried beneath a layer of grime and dust, but someone had carved it with intention. I pressed my hand flat against the surface and leaned in. The wall curved slightly inward, smoother than the rough-cut stone around it, and there was a faint draft, a whisper of air too cold to come from our own breath. That meant there was space beyond, not just dead stone. I called Rami over quietly and pointed to it. He crouched, examined the stamp, and nodded. "It's legit," he whispered. "Early French team probably marked it as unexplored or unstable. Could be a bypass shaft." He didn't sound excited, more like resigned. We both knew that if it hadn't been officially excavated, it also hadn't been reinforced. If the shaft collapsed under us, no one was digging us out. I turned to Lucille, who was trying to keep Stephen upright. He was barely conscious now. She was whispering to him in French again, half lullaby, half prayer. I told her about the shaft, how we'd need to crawl single file for a while, maybe 20 meters, maybe more. She nodded, and didn't ask what would happen if we couldn't carry him. She just adjusted her grip and said she'd manage. Mark helped his brother pack up what little we still had. He was quiet, jaw set hard, focused like someone twice his age. He'd stopped asking questions. That bothered me more than anything. At least when people are panicking, they're still human. But silence in a teenager? That's when you know something's been lost. We entered the shaft one by one. I led, followed by Rami, then the boys, Lucille and Stephen last. The passage was tight, barely enough room to crawl on hands and knees. Our clothes caught on the stone in places. At one point, my flashlight bounced off a slab of old timber wedged into a crack. Rotting wood, I gave it a wide berth. The air grew colder the deeper we went. That was a good sign. Less heat meant more space, more air movement. The stone ceiling dipped sharply after 10 meters, forcing us to belly crawl through the next section. Dust clung to my face, burned the inside of my nose. Every exhale felt too loud. Then Mark hissed something from behind us. "Stop," I heard something. We froze. I killed the light. Pitch black. No movement, no sound, nothing but our own breathing. Then I heard it too. A whisper, soft, wrong, like someone exhaling words without lungs behind them. It wasn't ahead, it was behind us. Lucille shouted Stephen's name, not loud but sharp, urgent. She twisted in the tunnel, trying to look back toward the entrance. I turned the flashlight back on, covered with cloth to dim the beam. The rear of the tunnel was empty, or seemed empty. Then something shifted in the dark, too fast, a scraping sound against the stone, a dragging. I shoved forward, pushing hard through the crawl space until I burst into the chamber on the other side. It was barely large enough to stand. I pulled the others through one by one. Mark, Daniel, Rami, then Lucille, who was screaming now, low and tight, like she was holding it back with everything she had. Stephen wasn't with her. I pushed past her, leaned into the crawl space, and aimed the light. What I saw still doesn't feel real. Stephen was being pulled backward, slowly, his heels scraping against the stone. His eyes were open, mouth slack. One of them had him by the arm, the flesh already torn. It was the same one we'd seen earlier, the broken-jawed thing that had slammed into the grate. Its leg was twisted backward, useless, but it crawled with one arm, and its mouth like it didn't know it should have been dead hours ago. Lucille lunged for him, but I held her back. I didn't say a word. She just stopped, sobbing silently, her hand reaching toward the dark like that could bring him back. I turned the flashlight off. I don't know how long we stood there. A minute, maybe 5. We didn't speak, just listened as the sounds of dragging grew faint, then stopped. Lucille was shaking but quiet. She wiped her eyes once, turned her back to the tunnel, and didn't look back again. I thought that would be it, that whatever followed us had what it wanted. But I was wrong. A sound erupted from the crawl space, a violent scuttling, frantic now, not just dragging, clawing. That thing wasn't done. It was coming through the tunnel, and fast. I pulled the flashlight out again and backed up. "Mark, tripod," I shouted. He grabbed the aluminum one from his backpack, the cheap, hollow-legged kind tourists use, and handed it to me. I took it and planted myself at the tunnel mouth. Rami held a second flashlight, beam steady on the entrance. The thing came out twisted, scraping its ruined body through the opening like it didn't care what bones cracked along the way. Its face was torn open, skin missing in patches. Its jaw snapped open and closed in silence. No growl, no breath, just instinct. I swung the tripod and caught it across the shoulder. It didn't even flinch, just kept coming. Mark threw a camera bag at it. Rami stepped forward and jammed the flashlight into its face. That finally staggered it, just for a second. Long enough for me to slam the tripod again, this time across its neck. The metal bent. The thing dropped for a second, then lunged again. Lucille grabbed a piece of old beam and drove it down against its back, pinning it for a moment. The thing twisted under the pressure, jaw clamping down on the wood, but not reaching her hand. We kept beating it until it stopped moving. Not from pain, it just couldn't move anymore. Its body twitched for a while after that, nerves firing, or whatever was left of them. I dropped the tripod. The legs were bent inward, coated in blood and dust. Daniel was curled in a ball in the corner, covering his ears. Rami stood frozen, staring down at the remains. Lucille backed into the wall and slid to the floor, her scarf gone, face scratched and streaked. Mark stood beside me. He didn't say anything, just breathed through his nose, chest rising slow and steady. When I looked over, he was holding a piece of broken lens glass in one hand, tight enough to draw blood. I pulled him aside and checked his arms, his neck, his face. No bites, no breaks. None of us had been bitten. We were lucky, stupid lucky. But that was it. That was the moment it all changed. Up until now, we'd been running from shadows, from echoes. Now we'd seen what those things could do, what it took to stop them, and what happened when we didn't act fast enough. The group was different after that. The silence wasn't just fear anymore, it was knowledge. It was the memory of flesh tearing and bones bending the wrong way. The sound of someone you just sat beside being dragged into a tunnel and vanishing. We didn't speak as we moved. There wasn't anything left to say. Stephen was gone. The things above us weren't just shadows anymore. We knew what they looked like, how they moved, how they kept coming even after their bodies should have quit. The air around us had changed, heavier somehow, like the pyramid itself had swallowed the noise of the outside world and now only listened to us. We followed the slope down past the chamber, deeper than I'd ever gone in this structure. Rami kept checking the walls with his flashlight, pausing at any mark that looked intentional. Most were just tool scars or natural wear, but every so often, one stood out, flattened, aligned, like someone had taken care to cut straight lines across the uneven stone. Markers. The shaft narrowed again. We hit a low crawl space, barely tall enough to fit the boys upright. I went first, brushing aside a layer of brittle debris, stone flakes, ancient wood dust, and clumps of mummified rodent remains that crumbled to nothing under my gloves. Something about the smell shifted again. The staleness deepened, filled with earth and oil and something underneath I couldn't place. It didn't smell alive, but it wasn't decay either. It was old. I paused just long enough to wipe my sleeve across the neck's surface and reveal more of the stone. There it was again, etched deeply this time, a series of slanted hash marks in sets of 3. Diagonal, angled down. It matched nothing official in the restoration records, but I'd seen something like it before. Back when I was a student, one of my mentors used to talk about the expedition led by Charles Wilford in 1838. His notes, half lost and discredited, mentioned a sealed chamber beneath the pyramid, lower than any known excavation. His journals were full of contradictions and exaggerations, but one consistent detail kept returning. 3 marks of descent carved into the wall before the shaft that whispered. It sounded like nonsense back then. Now it didn't. The crawl space opened up suddenly. We stepped into a cavity unlike the others, rounded, almost dome-shaped, with uneven flooring. It didn't have the symmetry or polish of the upper levels. This was carved fast, primitive, emergency work. Someone had needed a chamber here, and they hadn't cared about form. Rami swept the beam slowly around the edges. We all followed in a slow arc, hugging the walls. Then he stopped. There were black streaks along the far end, burn marks, soot, campfire smoke on stone. Someone had lit something in here long after the pyramid was built. Maybe 100 years ago, maybe longer. Mark crouched near the center and brushed away a thick layer of dust. His hand froze halfway through. I stepped closer. There were initials carved into the floor beneath the grime. English, faded by time, but clear. T.W. 1871, alongside what looked like a hashmark calendar scratched into the edge. Someone lived here, Rami said. He wasn't guessing. The evidence was all around us. Charred ends of wood planks, old cloth rags, rotted to threads, the handle of a rusted tool, the metal long eaten by moisture and age. I kicked something by accident and reached down to grab it. It was the remains of a leather strap, with buckles made from hand-cut iron. Daniel pointed to the far wall. Crude graffiti had been scratched into it with some kind of chisel. Shapes, mostly. Circles and eye-like patterns. Nothing sacred. No names of gods or kings. Just chaos. Panic drawings. One showed stick figures, maybe a dozen, arranged around a larger shape with jagged lines for teeth. I'd seen something similar once in an old Coptic shrine, carved by pilgrims trapped during a flash flood. Lucille sat down and said nothing. She hadn't spoken since we left the last chamber. Her scarf was gone, her blouse torn at the elbow, and her hands were trembling in her lap. Not shaking, just vibrating, like her muscles were running on a different current than the rest of her body. She kept looking toward the shaft behind us, expecting something to appear again. I pulled my pack around and passed out the remaining water, half sips for everyone. We'd have to start rationing in real numbers now. Rami counted supplies again. 2 energy bars, 1 half roll of gauze, the batteries from the broken flashlight, a bent multi-tool, and 3 phones with no network and dwindling charge. The real problem was light. My flashlight was down to 25%. Rami's was worse. Mark's camera battery was dead, and we had no way to recharge anything. That left us with a few precious hours of visibility before everything turned black. I swept the chamber again, this time slower. There had to be something more. Any clue about where this makeshift camp's occupants had gone. Then I saw it, tucked into a crack at the far end, half covered in debris. Not a tunnel, a gap, a vertical fault line just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The dust around it was disturbed. Not fresh, but not ancient either. Rami helped me clear the stones blocking it. It wasn't sealed intentionally, just collapse. Once we moved the heavier slabs, we could see the shaft drop sharply into darkness. It didn't go straight down like a well. It spiraled slightly, hugging the wall like a natural slide cut by years of erosion or deliberate chiseling. The temperature dropped again. I crouched and waved my hand over the opening. Air. Real airflow. Cold and slow but unmistakable. And underneath it, something else. A faint smell, metallic, like rust and wet stone. Not blood, not death, just buried things, forgotten. Daniel suddenly asked what happened to the people who left those marks, the initials, the calendar scratches. No one answered him. I didn't know if they made it out. All we knew for sure was that they'd been down here long enough to count days, to burn wood, to die or vanish. and no one had ever come to get them. Mark was already tightening the straps on his bag. "If it's open air," he said, "there might be another exit, a crack in the foundation, or a tunnel back to the surface." He looked like he wanted it to be true so badly that it would become real. I didn't want to take that away from him. We prepped slowly, tied a strip of cloth from an old sleeve to mark the chamber we were leaving. I etched a directional line in the soot on the wall, just in case we had to retreat blind. Then I climbed down first. The shaft was tighter than it looked. I had to wedge myself sideways and use my elbows for balance. Dust slid under my boots, sending quiet avalanches below. After a few meters, the spiral leveled out, forming a low tunnel barely wide enough to crouch in. I called up to the others and told them it was stable. One by one, they followed. When we reached the next chamber, it didn't look like anything I'd seen in modern excavation maps. The walls here were different, closer to limestone, porous and scarred. Tools had been used here, but not recently. Faint scratch marks led toward a sloped passage ahead, and along the wall, barely visible in the dust, were more human remains. 2 bodies, no flesh, just bones wrapped in the tatters of old explorer coats. Boots intact. One still held a rusted chisel. The other had collapsed with both arms extended toward the slope. Not arranged, not buried, just fallen. Lucille backed away the moment she saw them. She sat down near the wall, took off her watch, and stuffed it into her pocket without a word. Mark tried to cover Daniel's eyes, but the boy shoved him away and kept staring. Not in shock, not in fear, just watching, learning something terrible and permanent. We'd already stopped being tourists long ago. That moment, standing above 2 piles of bones in a forgotten pit under the world, made it final. There was no schedule anymore, no tour route to follow, no exit plan waiting to be radioed in. No one was coming to pull us out. These weren't ruins anymore. They were what was left. The air had gone sour again. It wasn't just the dust. It was the silence, dense and heavy, only occasionally broken by the shift of someone's boot or the creak of a knee as we all tried to rest in impossible positions. Our bodies weren't made to survive in stone like this. The coolness we once welcomed was starting to feel like rot. Lucille stopped responding to conversation entirely. She did what was asked, followed, packed, helped, but didn't speak unless someone directly asked her something. Even then, it was only yes or no. Her voice had gone dry and thin, like her throat had shut down everything except the bare minimum. Rami looked worse too. He'd been quiet since we left the graffitied chamber. I saw him checking the same folded excavation map at least 3 times in an hour, eyes scanning it like maybe it had changed since the last time. I asked him softly what he was looking for, and he just said, "Anything I missed." We gave up on proper sleep. The stone floor sucked every ounce of warmth from our bodies. We rested in turns, back to back or shoulder to shoulder, flashlights facing the tunnel mouths. I tried once to close my eyes for more than 10 minutes, but every time I drifted off, I'd hear something faint. Not voices, just pressure, as if the walls were listening. Our supplies were down to nothing. 2 water sips each, maybe 3 bites of an energy bar to split. I gave mine to Daniel and told him it was all I had left. He looked at me for a second too long, like he didn't know if I was lying to protect him or telling the truth. Either way, he took it and didn't thank me. That was fine. Then it happened again. The thing we'd feared but somehow still didn't believe could really happen more than once. We were moving down a sloped corridor, carefully stepping over loose stone where the floor had partially collapsed, when I heard a low gasp from behind. A sound that didn't fit the shape of breathing, wet and sudden. I spun with the light. Rami was pinned against the wall, arms braced, knees up. Something had emerged from the side vent of the tunnel. A tight vertical slit barely wide enough to squeeze through. A figure, partially rotted, with dried muscle hanging from its forearms and a throat half shredded open. It had grabbed him at the hip and was pulling. Not fast, not with strength, just persistence. Mark reacted first. He grabbed the broken aluminum tripod from Rami's pack and shoved it hard into the thing's chest. The shaft cracked, Useless, but it gave me enough space to wedge in and smash the flashlight against its temple. It didn't go down. It staggered, turned, and lunged. Rami pushed free, stumbled, then slipped on the gravel. The thing landed on him, jaws snapping inches from his neck. I grabbed its head, shoved my fingers into the eye sockets, and drove it back as hard as I could. Lucille grabbed a rock and brought it down again and again until it stopped moving. After it was over, no one moved for a while. Then Rami sat up. His pant leg was torn, a shallow wound on his calf, already seeping through the fabric. We all saw it. He looked at it, then looked at me. It didn't bite, he said. It clawed, I think. But his face was tight. The kind of tight you get when you already know what you're saying isn't true, or when you desperately need it to be true, even if it's not. Lucille stepped forward and asked to see the wound. Rami pulled the fabric up slowly. The gash was jagged, deep enough to break skin, not deep enough to tear muscle. No obvious bite arc, no teeth marks. Still, it wasn't clean. Not in a place like this. We were quiet. I didn't say yes or no. I just helped clean it with what little water we had left and wrapped it with the gauze. It wasn't the wound that scared me. It was the look in Rami's eyes. Mark pulled me aside later, when the others were sitting against the wall, drinking the last of the water. He asked me flat out, "If he turns, what do we do?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. He asked again. "I mean it. You're the one they listen to. You tell us." I said the only thing I could. We wait. We watch. If it happens, we do what has to be done. He didn't nod. He just walked back to Daniel, who had been tracing his fingers through the dust for the last hour, drawing patterns, the same pattern over and over again, 3 descending lines. We rested a little more, then kept moving. No destination anymore, just distance from the last thing that tried to kill us. The walls closed tighter as we descended into another layer, the light bouncing in odd directions, distorted by uneven stone. My flashlight was almost dead. We used it only in pulses now, just enough to spot hazards, then off again. The silence was worse than ever. We hadn't heard anything from above in hours. No distant thuds, no echoing shouts, just the absence of everything, like we were so far down the rest of the world had given up on us. I thought about Karim, my brother. I wondered if he'd made it out of Cairo, if he'd tried to reach the city center or gone to our mother's place first. I imagined him at the door of her apartment, shouting for her to pack a bag, trying to tune the radio, not knowing that there was nothing left to receive. The thought of them, of both of them, facing what we'd seen inside this pyramid, it made me sick. Not the violence, not the gore, just the silence, the feeling of being buried alive and knowing that the earth above you didn't care. Then came the breaking point. We stopped to rest inside a low, angular chamber, carved like a storage vault. Stone boxes stacked along the wall, most of them crumbled or split. We sat in silence for nearly 20 minutes. Rami had gone pale, sweating, his fingers twitching against the wall. The wound on his leg was seeping through the gauze again. Mark stood up, quietly walked over. "We can't keep going like this," he said. "You know we can't." Rami looked up, eyes glassy. "It's not infected." Mark said nothing, just stared, then said it again, louder this time. "We can't," Lucille finally snapped. "He's not turning." She stood, shielding Rami with her body like a wall. "You don't get to decide who lives and dies. None of us do." Mark stepped forward. "We all saw it. That thing grabbed him. He's getting worse by the hour. What happens if he changes in a tunnel and we can't move fast enough?" He wasn't yelling, but his voice was iron. "Final!" I stepped between them and told everyone to sit down. Not a request, not a discussion. I said it the way I used to talk to busloads of tourists when someone wandered off without a hat in 40-degree heat. Firm, non-negotiable. The tension didn't dissolve. It calcified. No more yelling, no accusations, just a kind of brittle quiet. Everyone sat, just like I'd told them, but no one relaxed. Rami was leaning into the wall, his head tilted forward as though the stone was the only thing holding him upright. Lucille watched Mark like he might suddenly lunge again, and Mark, he didn't take his eyes off Rami the entire time. I crouched near the edge of the chamber, close to a break in the wall, where fractured stone created a narrow wedge of shadow. I needed distance. Not to run. I wasn't going to leave anyone behind. I just needed air that hadn't passed through the others' mouths. Needed space where I could think for a minute without their fear pressing against my back. My flashlight was nearly gone. I flicked it on for 2 seconds at a time, scanning the edge of the wall, searching for some clue, any sign that we weren't just circling a stone grave. That's when I noticed it. A small square notch in the wall, almost perfectly cut, half filled with debris. I cleared it out carefully. Behind it was a crawl space, low and narrow, but just wide enough to slide through. The air on the other side was stale but moving. A breeze. A real one. I pressed my hand forward and felt it. There was airflow. Rami stirred when I returned. His eyes were glazed, skin pale and coated with a cold sweat, but he was still conscious. "Found something?" he asked, barely audible. I told him yes, and he tried to sit up straighter. I gave him a look. He leaned back down. I brought the others over and showed them the crawl space. It was tighter than anything we'd been through yet, barely shoulder width, angled upward in a steep climb. I said it was a ventilation shaft, maybe one of the early ones carved to release trapped gas during construction. The ancient builders used them in places like this. Rami, through clenched teeth, confirmed the theory. Mark asked where it led. I told him I didn't know, but it had airflow. That meant space. That meant outside, or something close to it. Lucille didn't say anything. She just helped Daniel get his pack on and started clearing the entrance. We went single file. I took the lead again, flashlight tucked under my chin, one hand in front, the other feeling the wall. The shaft was steeper than I expected. Not a straight incline, but a staggered zigzag, sloping at odd angles, sometimes flattening, sometimes narrowing, until I had to turn my body sideways to pass. I kept counting seconds in my head, just to stop my thoughts from spiraling. The rock began to flake as we moved higher. Chunks of stone broke under our palms, and several times we had to stop so Mark could help clear debris for Lucille and Daniel to crawl through. Behind them, Rami was moving slower now. I heard him coughing. Not loud, but thick, wet at the edges. Lucille heard it too. She didn't look back. After what felt like half an hour of crawling and scraping, we hit a collapse. A full section of the shaft had caved inward. We couldn't go forward. I nearly cursed out loud but held it in. Mark helped me clear rocks one by one, digging quietly with his hands. No tools left to help. Lucille and Daniel waited behind us in the darkness, not asking how long it would take. Then we heard the first echo from below. It wasn't a groan, not at first. It was just stone shifting. Then another, a breath. Not ours. Rami's voice came faint and hoarse from the back. "They're in the tunnels." I dropped my pack and cleared rocks faster. Mark beside me, digging like his fingers were numb. Lucille called ahead once, voice trembling. I told her to keep moving. She told me to hurry. Another groan echoed upward, closer this time, heavier, thudding against the wall like something was crawling blind, feeling its way by sound. I started to hear the rasp, the same kind we'd heard in the shaft when Stephen disappeared, the breathless, ruined inhale of something not alive but still moving. The rocks gave. A hole opened ahead. I shoved through and came out into a larger space. A natural cavity, not man-made. Broken and cracked, but open. Dust poured in behind me. I turned, grabbed Mark's arm, and hauled him through. Lucille passed Daniel forward next. He scrambled through fast, face scratched, arms flailing. Then Lucille came, nearly getting caught on a jagged edge. I yanked her free. Rami was last. He didn't move. He was at the edge of the shaft, hunched over, legs braced. The infected were close now. I could hear their weight, bodies scraping the tunnel. At least 3, maybe more. Rami looked at me and smiled. It was small, honest. "You need to go," he said. I told him to move, shouted. He shook his head. "I can't outrun them," he said. "If I crawl in, they'll follow. They'll get Daniel. They'll get Lucille. They'll get you." Mark stepped forward, but I held him back. Rami slid backward toward the tunnel mouth, pulling the last stone slab over the gap. His body blocked most of the entrance. We saw his silhouette brace himself. "I'm not dying in silence," he said. "Let it mean something." We heard them reach him. The sounds that followed weren't human. Not from him, not from them. Just a collision of bodies and breath and stone. I turned away. So did Mark. Lucille didn't move. Daniel started crying for the first time since his father died. Not loud, just steady. I don't know how long we waited. There was no time in that space. Eventually, when the echoes faded and the air cleared, we climbed higher. No one spoke about what had happened. No one asked whether Rami had turned before the end. It didn't matter. He saved us. We found a metal grate embedded in the ceiling of the shaft. It was bent, partially rusted, light barely visible through the slats. I climbed to it, pressed my shoulder into it and pushed. The frame groaned, metal scraping against stone, and then it gave. A hatch swung open. Outside air flooded in, real air, cold, dry, full of sand and stars and distance. We crawled out onto a slope of crumbling rock behind the pyramid, a utility access, probably forgotten decades ago, used during the construction of the tourist lighting system. We were out. The plateau was nearly empty now. Fires still burned in the distance, but no figures moved along the ridges. No military, no tourists, no sound but the wind. We didn't celebrate, didn't shout or cry. We just stood there, shoulders slumped, eyes squinting at the sky. I looked down at my hands, bloody and grey from dust, and realized I couldn't feel my fingers anymore. Mark sat beside his brother on the slope and pulled him close. Daniel stared at the desert horizon, blinking against the dry wind. Lucille took one step toward the road, then dropped to her knees and wept, hands buried in the sand. I didn't speak. There wasn't anything left to say that would sound human. The cold air on my skin felt like a lie. I kept expecting it to fade, to shift back into the heat of the tunnels, to pull me back underground and trap me again. But the wind kept moving, and the hatch stayed behind us. We were out. That should have meant something. It didn't feel like anything. The eastern sky was just starting to shift from black to grey, pre-dawn, but still deep enough in the night that the shadows held shape. We were behind the northern base of the pyramid, on a maintenance incline that had long since been buried in sand and neglect. I could see the rim of the plateau ahead, and beyond that, parts of the plateau's edge came into view, scattered shapes half covered in wind-blown dirt. We didn't move right away. The kind of exhaustion we felt wasn't just physical. It was the weight that hangs in your muscles when you know no one is waiting for you on the other side. Rami was gone. Stephen was gone. The others we saw, guards, workers, tourists, gone too. Their bodies might still be out there somewhere, but the people were gone. That truth sat in my spine like a splinter I couldn't dig out. Lucille stayed on her knees for a long time. She wasn't making any sound anymore, just rocking forward slightly, her hands sinking deeper into the sand with each breath. Daniel curled into Mark's side and closed his eyes, not sleeping, just pressing his face into the fabric of his brother's shirt like he didn't want to see what came next. Mark wasn't crying. I don't think he had anything left in him to cry with. He was already older than most people I knew, and he was still just a kid. I finally stood and scanned the slope. No infected, no movement. The fires in the distance still burned, small points across the horizon like dead stars. Smoke hung above Cairo, not a column, just a haze. Like the city itself had been reduced to a slow exhale. Every few seconds, a flash lit up the skyline. Maybe an explosion, maybe just light bouncing off the smoke. We were far enough away that the sound didn't reach us, but I remembered where everything was, even in the dark. The Nile was out there, beyond the southern ridge. So was my neighborhood, my mother's apartment, the places Karim and I used to visit after school when we were younger. Bookstores, food stalls, Street corners that used to mean nothing and now meant too much. I wondered how long they'd lasted, if anyone was still holed up in the shops, hiding in storerooms, waiting for the government to say it was over. I walked to the edge of the ridge. The sand gave beneath my boots, crusted hard on top but loose underneath, like everything out here, stable until it wasn't. I reached the crest and looked down. The main road leading out of the site was a mess of twisted barriers and burned-out vehicles. A military checkpoint had been set up there, probably a last-minute cordon when things first started collapsing. I saw at least 4 bodies, maybe more. Uniforms, rifles scattered, blood crusted in streaks across the ground. One of the trucks was still partially intact, windows blown out, passenger door missing. Another had been flipped onto its side. I didn't go closer. I didn't need to. Anyone who had been here when things fell apart wasn't alive now. The blood had dried too long ago. I turned and looked back at the others. Mark was helping Lucille to her feet. Daniel was still sitting, arms wrapped around his knees, head tucked down. I called to them quietly, waved for them to come. We couldn't stay exposed. If even one of the infected had followed us, or found another way out, we wouldn't have time to react. We moved slow. Lucille limped. Her ankle had taken a hit in the shaft, but she didn't complain. Mark carried Daniel most of the way. I kept pace ahead, flashlight clipped to my belt, not using it. The sky was growing brighter by the minute, desert gold breaking through ash-colored clouds. By the time we reached the outer road, the fires on the horizon were fading into daylight, but the smoke remained. There was no safe zone, no search party, no line of trucks handing out food or water, just wind and sand and silence. I started to think about water again, how much we needed, how long we could go without it. I checked the cargo truck, found 2 jugs in the back, sealed and unmarked. I cracked one open, sniffed. It was clean, at least a few liters, enough for a day, maybe 2 if we stretched it. We found a tattered blanket in the back seat and used it to block the sun. Lucille lay underneath it with Daniel while Mark and I scouted what little there was to find. No working radios, no fuel, no food, just rifles with empty mags and cracked helmets, signs of a fight lost quickly and badly. We waited the day out there, in the shell of the checkpoint. I kept my eyes north, toward the black spire of the Great Pyramid. Even in the day, its shadow stretched farther than it should have. We could still see the edge of the utility shaft we'd climbed from, still see the broken metal hatch that saved our lives. I don't know why, but I couldn't stop watching it, like part of me still expected Rami to crawl out of it. He never did. When night came again, the temperature dropped. Lucille wrapped Daniel in the blanket and told him stories in French. I caught parts of it, something about boats and rivers and stars, but most of it was just rhythm, a voice to replace the silence. Mark stood guard with me, holding a broken steel rod we'd pulled from the checkpoint gate. He looked like someone who'd fought in wars. He hadn't, but he looked the part now. We watched the ridge all night. Nothing came. No light, no signal. Just the shape of the pyramid in the dark, and the wind carrying the scent of smoke and dust. And now I'm here, recording this into what's left of my phone battery, because I don't want to forget what happened. I've guided people through ruins my whole life. I memorized facts, rehearsed my lines, told stories about ancient gods and dead kings. But that wasn't history. That was comfort. This is history now. I watched a man give his life to protect people he barely knew. I watched a father vanish into the dark because he was too weak to move. I watched a child stop crying because there wasn't any point left in tears. No one will build museums for us. No one will preserve these tunnels or carve names in polished plaques. What happened down there will fade like smoke over the desert, forgotten, buried. But I remember, and if anyone hears this, I want them to remember too. We didn't run. We didn't quit. We kept moving, even when everything told us not to. Because surviving isn't brave. It's necessary. And sometimes that's all that's left. The sun is rising again. We're heading east now, toward what used to be the old checkpoint at Saqqara. Maybe someone made it there. Maybe not. Doesn't matter. We'll go anyway. That's what we do now. That's all for now. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe to keep the stories alive. For now, stay quiet, stay vigilant, and stay alive. Jack's Nightmares, signing off. Until next time, survivor.